Daniel chapter 5 verses 1. Belshazzar the king made a great feast to 1,000 of his lords, and drank wine before the 1,000. Daniel chapter 5 verses 2. Belshazzar, whilst he tasted the wine, commanded to bring the golden and silver vessels which his father Nebuchadnezzar had taken out of the temple which was in Jerusalem, that the king, and his princes, his wives, and his concubines, might drink therein. Daniel chapter 5 verses 3. Then they brought the golden vessels that were taken out of the temple of the house of God which was at Jerusalem, and the king, and his princes, his wives, and his concubines, drank in them. Daniel chapter 5 verses 4. They drank wine, and praised the gods of gold, and of silver, of brass, of iron, of wood, and of stone. Daniel chapter 5 verses 5. In the same hour came forth fingers of a man's hand, and wrote over against the candlestick upon the plaister of the wall of the king's palace, and the king saw the part of the hand that wrote. Daniel chapter 5 verses 6. Then the king's countenance was changed, and his thoughts troubled him, so that the joints of his loins were loosed, and his knees smote one against another. Daniel chapter 5 verses 7. The king cried aloud to bring in the astrologers, the Chaldeans, and the soothsayers. The king spake, and said to the wise men of Babylon, Whosoever shall read this writing, and show me the interpretation thereof, shall be clothed with scarlet, and have a chain of gold about his neck, and shall be the third ruler in the kingdom. Daniel chapter 5 verses 8. Then came in all the king's wise men, but they could not read the writing, nor make known to the king the interpretation thereof. Daniel chapter 5 verses 9. Then was King Belshazzar greatly troubled, and his countenance was changed in him, and his lords were astonied. Daniel chapter 5 verses 10. Now the queen by reason of the words of the king and his lords came into the banquet house, and the queen spake and said, O king, live forever, let not thy thoughts trouble thee, nor let thy countenance be changed. Daniel chapter 5 verses 11. There is a man in thy kingdom, in whom is the spirit of the holy gods, and in the days of thy father light and understanding and wisdom, like the wisdom of the gods, was found in him, whom the king Nebuchadnezzar thy father, the king, I say, thy father, made master of the magicians, astrologers, Chaldeans, and soothsayers. Daniel chapter 5 verses 12. Forasmuch as an excellent spirit, and knowledge, and understanding, interpreting of dreams, and showing of hard sentences, and dissolving of doubts, were found in the same Daniel, whom the king named Belteshazzar, now let Daniel be called, and he will show the interpretation. Daniel chapter 5 verses 13. Then was Daniel brought in before the king. The king spake and said unto Daniel, Art thou that Daniel, which art of the children of the captivity of Judah, whom the king my father brought out of Jewry? Daniel chapter 5 verses 14. I have even heard of thee, that the spirit of the gods is in thee, and that light and understanding and excellent wisdom is found in thee. Daniel chapter 5 verses 15. And now the wise men, the astrologers, have been brought in before me, that they should read this writing, and make known unto me the interpretation thereof. But they could not show the interpretation of the thing. Daniel chapter 5 verses 16. And I have heard of thee, that thou canst make interpretations, and dissolve doubts. Now if thou canst read the writing, and make known to me the interpretation thereof, thou shalt be clothed with scarlet, and have a chain of gold about thy neck, and shalt be the third ruler in the kingdom. Daniel chapter 5 verses 17. Then Daniel answered and said before the king, Let thy gifts be to thyself, and give thy rewards to another. Yet I will read the writing unto the king, and make known to him the interpretation. Daniel chapter 5 verses 18. O thou king, the most high God gave Nebuchadnezzar thy father a kingdom, and majesty, and glory, and honor. Daniel chapter 5 verses 19. And for the majesty that he gave him, all people, nations, and languages, trembled and feared before him, whom he would he slew, and whom he would he kept alive, and whom he would he set up, and whom he would he put down. Daniel chapter 5 verses 20. But when his heart was lifted up, and his mind hardened in pride, he was deposed from his kingly throne, and they took his glory from him. Daniel chapter 5 verses 21. And he was driven from the sons of men, and his heart was made like the beasts, and his dwelling was with the wild asses. They fed him with grass like oxen, and his body was wet with the dew of heaven, till he knew that the Most High God ruled in the kingdom of men, and that he appointeth over it whomsoever he will. Daniel chapter 5 verses 22. And thou his son, O Belshazzar, hast not humbled thine heart, though thou knewest all this. Daniel chapter 5 verses 23. But hast lifted up thyself against the Lord of heaven, And they have brought the vessels of his house before thee, and thou, and thy lords, thy wives, and thy concubines, have drunk wine in them. And thou hast praised the gods of silver, and gold, of brass, iron, wood, and stone, which see not, nor hear, nor know, and the God in whose hand thy breath is, and whose are all thy ways, hast thou not glorified. Daniel chapter 5 verses 24. Then was the part of the hand sent from him, and this writing was written. Daniel chapter 5 verses 25. And this is the writing that was written, Mene, Mene, Tekel, Upharsin. Daniel chapter 5 verses 26. This is the interpretation of the thing. Mene, God hath numbered thy kingdom, and finished it. Daniel chapter 5 verses 27. Tekel, thou art weighed in the balances, and art found wanting. Daniel chapter 5 verses 28. Perez, thy kingdom is divided, and given to the Medes and Persians. Daniel chapter 5 verses 29. Then commanded Belshazzar, and they clothed Daniel with scarlet, and put a chain of gold about his neck, and made a proclamation concerning him, that he should be the third ruler in the kingdom. Daniel chapter 5 verses 30. In that night was Belshazzar the king of the Chaldeans slain. Daniel chapter 5 verses 31. And Darius the Median took the kingdom, being about 62 years old.